In the late 90s and early 2000s, the state of big-budget superhero movies was grim. The magic of Richard Donner's Superman and Tim Burton's Batman seemed like a peak that had since moved far out of reach. With the 90s coming to a close, and in light of Joel Schumacher's infamous Batman and Robin, tights and colors were on their way out. And thanks to The Matrix, grim black leather, sporty sunglasses, hackers, mall goths, and EDM dance clubs were the new unstoppable action trend. Honorable mention also goes to the first Blade movie for helping to cement this stylistic movement within the superhero genre. A lot of big-budget movies from this era ape these qualities, including early X-Men and Daredevil. These flicks were too cool for page-accurate costumes.
You actually go outside in these things?
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
They were too cynical for any sunshine. That's actually from the movie. I didn't edit it that way. Look, I'm not trying to hate on these movies. In fact, a few of them are pretty good. Like the first few X-Men movies hold up as well as they could, despite the fact that the first X-Men movie kinda looks like a TV show pilot. It's just that this style itself is so prevalent in all of them, and it gets kinda old. What comes to mind when I think of a typical action movie from this era is how samey they were. Rain, industrial settings, laboratories, a lot of movies trying to ape the look of The Matrix without any of the substance that made the original an instant classic. So naturally, Sony execs hired the cult favorite horror movie director Sam Raimi to make another grounded, gritty, and gray superhero movie, right? Oh my god, I can see colors. Sunshine, I see smiles, optimism, bright red and blue spandex, a protagonist with a kind heart, snappy camera moves with some actual style. How did the guy who made Evil Dead end up making this? Well, that's actually pretty clear. He wears his past movies on his sleeve. But his style is tailored in such a way that it genuinely enhances a classic set of stories from the 60s. In a lot of ways, Raimi is the perfect director for Spider-Man. He's perfect for most superhero properties. Obviously I love these movies, and I'm just looking for an excuse to talk about them. I promise, I'm not just indulging in my own nostalgia. Let's dig into and unpack why Sam Raimi was perfect for Spider-Man. In the 90s, there were several attempts to make a Spider-Man movie with James Cameron attached. There's a treatment floating around online for this one. I'll include a link in the description. It's overly dark and features an uncharacteristically rough Spider-Man. He straight up murders Sandman and at the very least manslaughters Electro. There's also this sex scene where Spider-Man ties MJ's wrists with his web on top of the Brooklyn Bridge. It basically reads like bad fan fiction, right down to the light kink. Rumors say that it would have starred Leonardo DiCaprio as Peter Parker and Arnold Schwarzenegger as Doc Ock. Actually, I can kind of see that the more I think about it. With a bowl cut, Arnold could totally pull off the look of the 90s animated series Doc Ock. Nonetheless, the early to mid 90s was not the right time for a Spider-Man movie. The special effects tech just wasn't there yet, and neither was the cultural acceptance of comic book weirdness. And James Cameron, while a bankable name, was not the right choice for director. Enter Sam Raimi. To really get into why Sam Raimi did such great work with Spider-Man, we've got to go back to his humble beginnings. A low-budget, indie cult classic with tons of camp, slapstick violence, and an extremely dynamic camera. The original was only created in an attempt to break into the film industry through grindhouse theaters and drive-ins. The Evil Dead succeeded in that and so much more. Not only was it banned in the UK, which is an honor in and of itself for a low-budget horror movie, The Evil Dead also quickly gained a fan base and critical acclaim. And it's no wonder why. On their own, these flicks are a fantastic blend of humor, gore, fantasy, and pure cinematic energy. So what exactly defines Sam Raimi's directorial style? A low-budget cabin horror movie director does not scream blockbuster superhero flick on the surface. However, there are a ton of stylistic parallels between Raimi's Evil Dead and his Spider-Man trilogy. Firstly, a huge part of the lasting appeal of the Spider-Man trilogy is in its corniness. The same goes for Evil Dead. Its charm is in its camp. Raimi's techniques of terror weren't left by the wayside either. His methods in directing Spider-Man are a lot like those he used in The Evil Dead, although Spider-Man had an astronomically bigger budget. They've both got a corny sense of humor, a very dynamic camera, and even some horror sprinkled in. Instead of employing these techniques for cheap scares, Raimi uses horror DNA to raise stakes, engage viewers, and to add his own stylistic flourish. Here are just a few examples of classic Spider-Man moments that are straight out of Evil Dead. The moment where Norman talks to himself in the mirror, more than a little reminiscent of a similar sequence from Evil Dead 2.
I don't think so.
There's also the white deadite eyes on Osborn when he's first taking the goblin steroids. As an aside, the cheap-looking Sith eyes in the Evil Dead remake are terrible and I hate it. It's the only part of the big-budget remake that somehow looks cheaper than the original. You sure you didn't summon anything from the Necronomicon, Norman? Actually, I think that technically the Necronomicon is canon in the Marvel Universe, though it is just a chapter from the Darkhold. There's a potential MCU crossover I'd love to see.
Hail to the king, baby.
What were we talking about? Right, Spider-Man. That iconic evil POV camera move also shows up a lot in the Spider-Man movies. We can see the same technique used in the symbiote POV in Spider-Man 3, and as the AI tentacle POV in Spider-Man 2. There are also a bunch of near jump scares in all of these movies, especially the first one, like this scene.
Back to formula.
And this one.
Last night I was...
What?
And this fucking nightmare noise. I don't know, maybe it's because I was a scared little idiot 4-year-old when it came out, but the first Spider-Man scared the shit out of me when I saw it in theaters. There's even this jump scare adjacent moment from Spider-Man 2. And this straight up demonic shit from Spider-Man 3. There are a few instances of implied gore, like the glass shard to the fucking face from Spider-Man 2. The first Spider-Man movie also probably has more blood than any other superhero movie. Okay, scratch that. More blood than any other superhero movie except Blade, of course. Do I have to talk about that gross drop of blood from Spider-Man 1? It's so thick and red, like ew. Why does this superhero movie have an excessive close-up of blood dripping from an open wound? Not to mention this entire surgery sequence from Spider-Man 2. Are they about to saw into his spine? I mean, come on, this is straight up horrific no matter how you look at it. It also has a delightful Easter egg reference to Evil Dead 2. The only way you could have an even more obvious reference to Evil Dead would be to cast Bruce Campbell as a different character in each movie.
Hail to the king, baby.
So not only does Sam Raimi make frequent references to his own horror roots, these movies also show a lot of reverence for classic gothic tropes. Raimi completely leans into the doppelganger idea for the Venom storyline in Spider-Man 3, which is a well-known convention of gothic literature. I know that Topher Grace's casting choice is controversial, but if you look at his character as being an anti-Peter Parker, it actually kinda works. He's the Shadow Spider-Man, of course he looks like a skinny nerd too. Doppelgangers and whatnot. There's also pretty clear inspiration taken from some of the most influential horror movies of the past century. Both of the first films had a mad scientist as villains. Osborn in the first film especially evokes a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde energy, while Octavius a little bit less so, but still, same vibe. All the villains in these movies evoke campy horror energy. Instead of being cringe, moments like this give Raimi's trilogy a unique vision and style, while staying firmly planted in the realm of the superhero movie. I think we've established that pieces of Raimi's horror roots are all over these movies, So now it's time to address the camp. With all these horror elements present, it's almost surprising that these films feel brighter than most of their contemporaries. The horror stylings in these films don't result in a scary movie, despite my first impression of the Green Goblin as a 4-year-old. The horror style is used in small doses to establish a certain character's perspective, as well as to create suspense and thrills. I posit that the reason these horror elements don't make this movie dark and gritty is because of another key aspect of Raimi's directorial style: camp. One of the biggest criticisms for these movies that I see going around is that they're just too campy. But what if I told you that embracing a campy tone is beneficial to the superhero genre? There's no denying that these movies are campy as hell.
Wackadoo!
However, in my opinion, camp is another aspect of Raimi's aesthetic that translates extremely well to the superhero genre. Where the Evil Dead trilogy and The Show use camp as a way to undercut suspense with a punchline, the Spider-Man trilogy uses camp to evoke an upbeat and endearing tone. This is in part why these movies feel like a breath of fresh air compared to the grimdark tone of most action movies from the same era. It's not just that these movies are lighter than their contemporaries, though. For example, the current Marvel Studios flicks are also pretty light in tone, but not in the same way as Raimi's trilogy. I love me some MCU, but hear me out. Often in the MCU, emotional or serious moments are completely undercut by a joke or playful quips. An emotional beat in MCU movies rarely gets the time it needs to sink in.
It's probably for the best that we never see each other again. That's what you always wanted.
Raimi's Spider-Man flicks, on the other hand, are completely comfortable with getting serious as hell at times.
Happy birthday. You need it more than I do.
No, I can't take that.
Yes, you can. You can take this money from me. For God's sake, it's not much. Now take it.
By creating a campy world in which to exist, Raimi can balance a colorful tone with heavy emotions. The world is campy, but the characters take it seriously. The setting can feel tonally bright without sacrificing emotional story beats. The Spider-Man No More sequences from Spider-Man 2 are pretty melodramatic, but also genuinely effective at conveying the weight that is pressing on Peter's shoulders. The corniness doesn't always work though. For one, the frequent focus on New Yorkers, while endearing, is pretty cringy at times. It's very much a relic of post-9/11 New York. These cutaways definitely work to make the environment feel more hopeful and bright though. Furthermore, there's a lot of slapstick in these films, which is another reflection of the humor from Raimi's Evil Dead movies. There's actually some pretty great comedic rhythm in this scene.
Hi, Pete.
Although admittedly, some of it is a little too wacky.
Wackadoo!
There's other moments where it's unclear if the intention was to be funny, but I still laugh my ass off every time. Ah, shit, that looks kinda serious. You good, man? So yeah, these movies aren't perfect, and just because I'm a fanboy doesn't mean I can't acknowledge their faults. In fact, let's do just that. What were they thinking with this goblin suit? To hire one of the most expressive faces in the business, a dude who quite literally looks like a goblin, and then cover up his face? You just know the dude is acting his ass off in this scene, but none of his facial performance is conveyed on screen. This design choice is especially tragic when you consider the fact that this was one of the test designs of the goblin suit. Like, I get that this isn't exactly realistic, but neither is a 40-year-old in a bright green Power Ranger suit. God, that would have been so cool. While this movie established the structure of the superhero origin story, it also unfortunately established the storytelling trend where the momentum of the entire story comes to a screeching halt once the protagonist becomes a superhero. Peter becomes Spider-Man about halfway through, and suddenly it's unclear what anyone wants. Superhero origin movies are pretty boring, and Spider-Man 1 definitely deserves at least partial blame for influencing how they're told. We gotta talk about MJ too. She is the damsel in distress every time. Like, can we give her something to do other than being kidnapped? It seems like every story beat she's involved with is motivated by a man she's with. She's also just genuinely unlikable in all of these movies. It's probably due to a mixture of lazy writing and poor casting, but Kirsten Dunst comes across as one of the most uncharismatic actors I've ever seen. MJ should be a magnetic, irresistible, self-motivated, and independent character. Instead, she's just relegated to being a mopey archetype. I mean, her actual ambitions as a person take a backseat to her being on a dude's arm in every installment. Her character needs a total rewrite and recast, in my opinion. Also, she's kind of a cheater? Come on, Pete, you can do better. Or not, you're actually kind of a piece of shit too. As an aside, the relationships in the MCU Spider-Man movies have been so much more fun and believable so far. Spider-Man 2 is almost perfect, but this sequence always bothered me. Why wouldn't you just use some sort of remote-controlled device to do this experiment? I don't know, maybe some kind of robot that isn't surgically attached to your spine? It doesn't even have to be AI, just like a controller with some joysticks that move the arms to manipulate the precious tritium.
Precious tritium.
This is so damn contrived. Another side note about Spider Media that did this story better. I like that in Spider-Man PS4, Doc Ock works in prosthetics. That makes more sense and is a lot more sympathetic a reason to attach robo-tentacles to your body. As for Spider-Man 3, yeah, it has some flaws. Chiefly among them is the fact that 3 main villains are established within the first 11 minutes of the movie. The first act should come with seatbelts because it gave me some serious whiplash trying to keep up with the story. It is cramped, to say the least. Also, the whole thing with Bernard holding back really important information from Harry until the absolute last second feels so forced. I shouldn't be too harsh on him though, he's getting pretty up there in age.
We're having a guest. Can you get some food?
Harry, don't tell Bernard what to do, he's old. Get a new butler, he looks like he's about to drop dead. Give Bernard a pension.
We just get some food?
Right away, sir.
You made the food yourself. Harry Osborn, you really are a villain. Spider-Man 3 is without a doubt the weakest of the trilogy. However, I don't think it's nearly as bad as its reputation posits. Like I said, Spider-Man 3 is no masterpiece, but it is absolutely watchable and I dare say very entertaining. I think a big chunk of its bad reputation comes from the era in which it was released. In 2007, expectations for summer blockbusters and sequels were very different than they would be even just 5 years later. What do I mean by that? Well, for context, audiences in 2007 didn't watch superhero movies with the expectation that each one contributed to a larger universe. Each film stood on its own, and if it was a sequel, it was expected to top the previous entry in every way. Today, audiences are much more open to sitting through something like Thor because they know that it'll contribute to the Avengers later on. The way we watch superhero movies today is a lot different in my opinion. Fans are more concerned with the whole of the franchise than they are with standalone films. From a modern perspective, Spider-Man 3 fits really well within the context of the Raimi-verse. By 2007 standards, yeah, Spider-Man 3 is a disappointment, but in retrospect, it isn't even a fraction as bad as some of the super duds we've had to endure since then. I'd watch Spider-Man 3 100 times before I'd ever watch the bland nonsensical mess that is X-Men Age of Apocalypse, or the aimless retread that is The Amazing Spider-Man. I firmly believe that if a movie like Spider-Man 3 came out today, it would not receive the level of harsh criticism that it did in 2007. Hell, it's at least as good, if not better, than some of the C-tier MCU movies. Spider-Man 3 has a ton of redeeming qualities that make it at the very least a solid addition to the genre of superhero films. It should be impossible to follow up Danny Elfman, and yet Christopher Young knocked it out of the park with his score for Spider-Man 3. You can tell he really dug into the recurring motif of a dark reflection, a shadow hero. Young's theme for the symbiote suit is beautifully dark and triumphant. It's very reminiscent of Elfman's score for '89's Batman, but it also is itself a perfectly dark reflection of the original Spider-Man theme. The original theme evokes the sense of a spider scuttering quickly up a wall, with delicate string instruments front and center. Before crescendoing with an epic web swing. The symbiote theme puts heavy wind instruments in the foreground, evoking a sense of lumbering, reckless power. Before climaxing in a tragic fall. Young's Sandman theme also elevates the power of Sandman's tragic and beautiful transformation. Let's talk about this scene for a minute. Without any words, this scene tells a beautiful story about a person crumbling and building themselves back up for someone they love. It perfectly establishes Sandman's power set and motivation without a single word. If it were up to me, this scene alone would have been the introduction to the character, because it is so powerful and effective. The awkwardly spoon-fed motivations that we see are so much weaker and genuinely detract from his character.
I'm not a bad person. Just had bad luck.
The added cast members are also all pretty good. Thomas Hayden Church is alright. He definitely has moments where he looks like the spitting image of comic Sandman. Bryce Dallas Howard is also a great addition to the cast. In fact, her performance as Gwen Stacy is a lot more charismatic and likable than Kirsten Dunst as MJ. She would have made for a much better Mary Jane in my opinion.
That was all for her?
Finally, let's talk about Topher Grace. He definitely isn't the obvious choice, however I do think he is the right choice for the story that this movie tries to tell. If Venom is supposed to be the dark and evil version of Spider-Man, then Topher Grace as Eddie Brock is a great casting choice as a reflection of Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker. They're both skinny dorks, one good and one bad. With Topher's comedic chops, he actually would have made for a really great Peter Parker in his younger days. Another thing that I love about Spider-Man 3 is that the Harry-Peter conflict reaches its peak, which has been set up in the previous two movies. Despite the fact that Harry's goblin costume makes him look like a niche extreme sports athlete, I really do think that he should have been the focus of this movie. Their friendship falling apart and being built back up would have made for an extremely satisfying arc had it not been underbaked and rushed at the very end of the trilogy. Raimi himself admits that more focus should have been given to already established characters in Spider-Man 3, saying that,
"It's a movie that just didn't work very well. I tried to make it work, but I didn't really believe in all the characters, so that couldn't be hidden from people who love Spider-Man. If the director doesn't love something, it's wrong of them to make it when so many other people love it. I think raising the stakes after Spider-Man 2 was the thinking going into it, and I think that's what Doom does. I should have just stuck with the characters and the relationships and progressed them to the next step, and not tried to top the bar."
Imagine what could have been if Harry and Peter's relationship had been the focus of this movie. Their tumultuous conflict took a backseat in the first two movies, so having it boiling over as the focus would have been such a great crux for the end of the trilogy. There are inklings of that idea throughout Spider-Man 3, and when it's there, it really works. Finally, Spider-Man 3 has the most Mr. Ditkovich scenes. That in itself makes it arguably the best Spider-Man movie of all time.
Then you say, "You're a good woman, I'm good man."
In all seriousness, if it's been a while since you last saw Spider-Man 3, go back and give it a watch. It isn't perfect, but it's about as good as a B-tier MCU movie. It definitely was not bad enough to warrant tanking the series and rebooting with a basketball-textured supersuit. It really is a shame that we never got to see a fourth installment in the series. Even at their worst, these movies have a ton of qualities that make them enjoyable. Excellent casting, solid writing, the greatest of all time superhero score, and so on. But I think what makes these movies so important to the history of superhero films is their directorial style, and that can only be attributed to Raimi. These fun, colorful superhero movies came out years before Marvel Studios even got off the ground. It's not unreasonable to assume that if these movies were never made, then the superhero genre would have died a decade ago. The genre would have had an open casket funeral clad in leather and angst. Before 2008's Iron Man came out, the superhero movie was tanking. Between X-Men The Last Stand, X-Men Origins Wolverine, Rise of the Silver Surfer, Superman Returns, the genre was in need of some new energy. And in terms of making an optimistic version of the genre, the MCU has done a great job, especially in terms of Spider-Man movies. The MCU Spider-Man is arguably the best on-screen version that fans have ever seen. The only thing lacking in these flicks is any kind of directorial style. Let's face it, a lot of superhero movies are starting to feel pretty samey again, like they did back in the 90s and 2000s. Instead of black leather cynicism, we've got quippy one-note team-ups. I'm not dissing the MCU, I love these movies, but it does kind of feel like the superhero genre has just traded one trend for another. So what can the MCU learn from Sam Raimi? More moments of dynamic direction like this, and this, and less flat colorless moments like this. And please, no more muddy colors like this. Even just more colorful and dynamic palettes, like in Guardians of the Galaxy and Thor Ragnarok. There's such a wide variety of art styles in comic books, even a single writer's run often jumps between art styles issue to issue. I wish the Marvel movies emulated that more. I wish they were more actively embracing the variety of styles that their characters can embody. Like I said, I love the MCU, but you know what I'd love more? To see a variety of visual styles from film to film. This is a visual medium after all. Let's take advantage of it. That's where Raimi's style stands above and beyond most Marvel movies. He takes advantage of the visual medium, whether that's through horror stylings or camp. In that way, he perfectly suits the superhero genre. Luckily, it looks like Raimi has been hired on for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Along with that, I hope Raimi can bring a bit of his own tastes to the table. kind of like Taika Waititi was able to do with Thor Ragnarok. In Raimi's case, I hope his MCU debut has some callbacks to Universal horror, or uniquely dynamic camera movements, or some more visual comedy. Nonetheless, two things are obvious to me. Sam Raimi was perfect for Spider-Man back in 2002, and to this day he is still perfect for the superhero genre. Hopefully, with the infinite resources of the MCU and Raimi's experience as a one-of-a-kind filmmaker, their combined efforts can help make the MCU feel a little less samey and a little more Raimi.